and welcome to a presentation that I'm calling Immanuel on the Times of Pestilence. For anybody who is compulsive about taking notes, I will let you know that I will put this into a booklet form sometime after Christmas, so probably in February or so. That should be available.
Yeah. Oh, great.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I want to try to do 5 things in the next hour. We'll see how successful I am. But I want to talk about the nature of epidemics, and then about disease patterns in what we call the urban frontier in America in the early part of the 19th century. Take a look at Chicago in 1854, and Immanuel also in 1854. And then fast forward a little bit to some of the later epidemics, but the main one we're going to take a quick look at is 1918. So feel free to break in at any point if you have a question, but I'm going to start rolling here. The first issue I want to deal with is what is an epidemic? And I think we know that only too well, but the dictionary definition is simply an outbreak of a contagious disease. Whereas a pandemic tends to be on a much larger scale. So it's either covering an entire country or, in some cases, the world. There's also a term that we need to use, and that's called endemic, which is a disease that is regularly found among people. And so it's the kind of the opposite of an epidemic, though it's also a form of disease. Now, most of what I'm looking at about epidemics comes from a book which I highly recommend. William McNeill, who was one of my teachers at the University of Chicago and chairman of the Department of History at that time, wrote a book in 1976, so 45 years ago, called Plagues and People. And that is still kind of the definitive work on the subject, though there's certainly been a lot more precise studies done on that issue. And McNeill identifies what he calls, and I think is a wonderful terminology, he calls microparasites and macroparasites. And microparasites are the microbes, the viruses, and all the various organisms that cause disease. Whereas macroparasites are things like war and revolution and mass destruction. So we're going to be looking at microparasites, and one of McNeill's points is that there seems to be a pattern. If you look all the way back 5,000 years in history, there seems to be a pattern among diseases among peoples, and that is that there are outbreaks or epidemics, but then, generally speaking, people get used to the illness, and it recurs only as what we call childhood diseases, like measles and mumps and so forth. So the disease in that case, if it's endemic, becomes dangerous only to outsiders. If a community that has this an endemic disease comes in contact with people who have never encountered it before, then you have the makings of an epidemic. Now, we know in the diseases of this kind, and I'm not going to go into any of this in great detail, but that there are several different types of transmissions for diseases, for infectious diseases, that is. One of them is human-to-human contact, which would be either by breathing or droplets from sneezes or coughs, blood, or skin contact of some other kind. There are some diseases that use an intermediary, such as a mosquito or a flea, and there are some that have multiple intermediaries. And then there is a way that you can transmit disease through water or food. So we're going to see in the case of the 2 major epidemics in Chicago, the cholera epidemic and the 1918, we have 2 different means of transmission. The 1918 was primarily by breathing, whereas the cholera epidemic was almost entirely by water and food transmission. Now, the final point I want to make, well, next to the last point I want to make from McNeil's book, is that the birth of urbanization means the birth of epidemics. You need to have a certain number of people to gather in order to have an epidemic. And so the urbanization of bringing large numbers of people together is a kind of a natural breeding place for epidemics. Finally, I want to take a point from McNeil talking about vectors, and I think we've all become very familiar with that terminology recently. But there are three main vectors, and certainly a lot of others, but the main ones are immigration, people moving from one place to another and bringing their diseases with them, or else coming in contact with the people who have a disease and they don't have any immunity to it. The second vector is trade, and we'll see that at work. And then the third is war and revolution, the movement of armies. And it so happens in Chicago history, all three of those vectors play a part, though certainly the immigration is the major factor, the major vector. Okay, let's talk about, move in a little bit closer to home, talk about the area that we sometimes call the Old Northwest, which includes the Great Lakes states plus a few others. Developed from the period from 1790 to about 1840. There was a massive urbanization that occurred in this area. Whereas in 1790 you have very, very little urban life west of the mountains, by 1840 you have at least 9 major cities and several minor ones already well on the way to development, and some of them as large as 50,000 people. So the cities are, and they're all familiar to us. I was just counting how many I've been in. But anyway, in Pennsylvania, you have Pittsburgh, which we don't think of as a western city, but at that time it was. Ohio, we have Cincinnati and Cleveland and Sandusky. In Kentucky, we have Louisville and Lexington. In Illinois, of course, Chicago. In Wisconsin, we have Milwaukee. And then in Missouri, the farthest west of all, we have St. Louis. Now, all of those cities, with the exception of Lexington, had some things in common in terms of their geography. They were all adjacent to water, either rivers or lakes. Some are on the Great Lakes, some are on the Ohio River, some on the Mississippi River. Now, that was also a reason why they were developed. It was because of the presence of water. And this is one of those good news, bad news things. And the good news is that this is a very convenient source of water for drinking water and also industry, which uses a tremendous amount of water. The bad news, which started out as good news but turned very bad, was that this is an easy place to dump the sewage, your trash, your garbage, and human waste of all kinds. And so all 9 of these cities, well, excepting Lexington, the 8 of these cities followed this practice. You took your drinking water out of the lake or the river, and then you dumped all of your refuse into that same body of water. Mm. And so we have a recycling movement here, and it's a recycling of filth. And in 1832, a man by the name of Daniel Drake, who was a doctor, and probably Anthony Fauci's predecessor in many ways, told the people of Cincinnati, the city fathers, that if you would just improve the quality of water, you could deal with the cholera problem. Cincinnati had just had a major outbreak of cholera. Well, the city fathers didn't take this very kindly, and according to one story, they drove him out of town. Drake's autobiography himself does not mention that particular incident, but nonetheless, he kept on arguing for this, and eventually, in about 15 years, Cincinnati did improve the quality of their water. but it took a long time and a lot of dead people before they did that. Now, let me just, if you're not familiar with cholera, hopefully none of us are really familiar with cholera. It's transmitted only one way, I would say 98% of the time, and that is either through bad water or tainted food. And these are usually these water and food that has come in contact with either human or animal excrement of some kind. There are no mosquitoes involved in cholera. There are no fleas. You cannot catch it by simple person-to-person contact. It's caused by a bacteria, not a virus. And the bacteria, in fact, was not identified until almost 50 years later by the German scientist Robert Koch. Cholera starts out with the early symptoms are usually stomach pains, which then become increasingly bad, followed by vomiting and diarrhea. And in most cases, the major impact on the body is dehydration. The mortality rate of cholera, and this is true then and it is true today, approaches 50%. So if you come down with cholera, depending on what shape your body is in, you have about a 1 in 2 chance of surviving. In the case of many, death often occurred within 24 hours. Very virulent disease. As I said, it's a messy disease, and it's easily passed by unsterile habits. Somebody could sometimes get cholera, well, simply by drinking water that had come in contact with, unlaundered bedclothes or things like that. But again, the main problem was the water supply, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Now, the cholera epidemics in this area, there was a whole series of them, and the first one was in 1823 in Pittsburgh, and then 1832 was a horrible year. The epidemic hit Cincinnati, Cleveland, Detroit, Louisville, Chicago, and St. Louis, all in the same year. The following year, there was an epidemic in Lexington, about which I've been able to find very little, and then the following year after that in Detroit. Then in 1849, we have the second horrible wave, and that was in Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Chicago, Sandusky, Toledo, and even made it all the way down to Nashville, Tennessee. 1852, Chicago had another epidemic. And then 1854 was the third of the really horrible ones. So you have 1832, 1849, and 1854. And that one struck first Louisville and then Chicago and Milwaukee. There was another epidemic right after the Civil War in Cincinnati that does not seem to have affected Chicago primarily. And the last epidemic of cholera in Chicago was in 1873. So a long history, 50 years of cholera epidemics. I don't have any figures for the total number of dead, but it's got to be rather scary. Anyway, let's take a look at Chicago in 1854. Again, remember the city of Chicago is only 21 years old at this point. The population of Chicago was about 30,000 people. It was made up of very diverse groups. There were a few Native Americans still in the city. Most of the leadership, financial, political, religious, consisted of Yankees, which is kind of an overall term for people from New England and New York and maybe even Philadelphia. There was a sizable German immigrant population, as well as Norwegians and Swedes, and then the Irish had started coming just a couple years before that. And Chicago was divided, just as it is now, into many different neighborhoods. So Lake Street, if you can sort of picture your map of Chicago today, Lake Street was the main business district. And that's where the better stores, the hotels, well, I think the churches were mostly behind Lake Street, but there may have been some churches on Lake Street also. So the area that we call the North Loop, or the north side of the loop, just behind Lake Street, is where the civic buildings and the better homes and many of the churches were, the society district, so to speak. There was a residential area south along the Chicago River, which seems to have been primarily housing Irish immigrants, though I found some references, some of the Norwegians lived down there too. The near north, which is sort of the area from the river, consider the river, from the river up to Division Street and from, again, from the river over to the lake, that area was the most heavily built up and the most populated, and that's where the Swedes and the Germans primarily lived. With some Norwegians, and again, maybe some Yankees had some of the better houses there. Most of the people lived in tenements, which were not, if you picture New York tenements of 4 or 5 stories and, hundreds of families, they weren't that kind of tenement. They were much smaller, usually only 2 stories, but they were all wooden structures. Indoor plumbing, of course, was not even a possibility for most of those people. It was not a particularly pleasant area. There was one area that was even worse, and that's what we now call Streeterville, where Northwestern University is located, downtown. And that was, by and large, populated by Norwegians. And this is kind of like I don't know what you would call it, a tent, not a tent village as much as just shacks, a shanty town type of area, and most of these were either day laborers or sailors, and primarily a male population, quite young, but a rather rowdy place. You did not walk into that Streeterville at night, certainly. Now, back to water for a moment. Where did the water come from? Because everybody needs a certain amount of water every day. Well, there were some wells that had been dug. They were often shallow, and they were almost always contaminated. There were very few pure water wells in Chicago at that point. And because the wells were inefficient and contaminated, they set up a bunch of pipelines. And there were 2 private companies that provided water by way of pipelines. However, where did the water come from? It came from the lake. Now, the raw sewage from Chicago was discharged into the river, and the river flowed into the lake where the people took the water for the pipelines. So you had a built-in disaster situation. Now, there were some people that weren't happy with the pipelines, and so there was a bottled water, probably a couple companies that did that. But again, where did they take their water? Straight out of the lake. So you had your choice of having contaminated water from your own well, from a pipeline, or from bottles. It was almost impossible to get pure water in the city of Chicago at that time, unless you were wealthy enough so you had your own system of filtering the water and then boiling it and then probably filtering it again. That was the only way you really had drinkable water. And I'm assuming that some of the hotels probably adopted that procedure, because the last thing the hotel wants is everybody dying on while they're guests in the hospital. I mean, guests in the hotel. So anyway, one person has described, and this is from the 1850s, so this is contemporary with the cholera epidemic, that if you examined water that came out of the tap, it often contained pieces of clothing or parts of animals that were not known to Noah when he built his ark. Exactly what that means, I'm not sure. But nevertheless, the idea of a dog's ear and a piece of clothing coming out of your tap water is not a very happy one. Now, by the way, this was not really remedied. You did not have really good water in Chicago until the late 1870s. So it took another 25 years or so before they really cleaned up their act. I mean, obviously it got better, but it wasn't anywhere near optimal. Okay, the first cholera epidemic, or I guess you would say the first cholera cases, were brought by, guess who? The U.S. Army. General Winfield Scott brought a number of soldiers from Pittsburgh because they were apparently they were afraid of some Indian uprisings, is what it amounted to. And so he brought a boatload of cholera-ridden soldiers to Chicago, most of whom were immediately confined to Fort Dearborn. There's not an awful lot of evidence that it infected the general public. I don't think there was that much interaction. But nonetheless, that was the first outbreak. Then the later ones, especially 1849, 1854, were mostly caused by immigration. And it was kind of a basic rule that if you have immigrants from Ireland, they were probably all infected with the disease by the time they hit Chicago. This is true of other immigrants too, but it was particularly noted that this was a problem among the Irish population. Now, if you got sick with cholera, what did you do other than wait around to die? So I want to talk a little bit about medical care in Chicago in 1854. It's pretty easy to talk about. I can do it in about 5 minutes or so. There were private physicians, of course. It seems to be a rather large number of them, actually, considering the size of the city. As we'll see, they already formed some medical colleges. But the only city hospital originally was one built in 1843, and it was built to house smallpox and cholera sufferers indiscriminately. Those two were mixed up, which must have been bad for everybody, I would think. But it wasn't only the smallpox and cholera patients. It was also anybody who was homeless or mentally ill could be taken into this hospital. The hospital was built on North Avenue, and if you can picture where the Chicago History Museum is right now, at Clark and North Avenue, it was a little bit to the east of that. And it was actually part of a cemetery, which is kind of convenient in a way, that the hospital would be in the middle of a cemetery. And there's still one gravestone from that cemetery that still exists there. Well, that hospital is obviously inadequate, and I don't have any figures on how big it was, but my guess is it was probably no more than 30 beds, if that. So they built the second hospital at 18th Street and LaSalle, which was sort of the middle of nowhere, and this was the idea. You want to keep your hospitals out of areas that had population. And so you have one at the very north end of the city, which is North Avenue. You have one at the very south end, 18th Street. By the way, when they get around to building a mental hospital, where do they put it? 12 miles outside the city. And what is now known as Dunning, or changed its name many times. Anyway, the first real hospital, if you can call it that, other than just a place to dump sick people, was the Illinois General Hospital of the Lakes, which had a rather impressive name. And it was housed in a hotel which, for some reason or other, had ceased to function as a hotel. And that was located roughly where the Wrigley building is now, on the north side of the river, Michigan Avenue, though it wasn't Michigan Avenue at that time. I've found two different figures on this. One say it was a 12-bed hospital, the other a 14-bed. But you can see it wasn't very big. Medical care, ready for this? Medical care was free. The doctors did not charge anything as long as they could use you as examples for their medical students. And so it was a teaching hospital and with free care. However, you did have to pay for your room and board, and that came to $3 a week. So if you were in the hospital for 2 weeks, at the end of it, your bill would have been $6. Now, the city very soon, very early, recognized, probably even the same year they established the hospital, realized they didn't know anything about running a hospital. And they were approached, we're not sure which, by a order of nuns from Ireland called the Sisters of Mercy, who agreed to take over management of the hospital. And they did that indeed. There's now Mercy Hospital, which is in danger of closing after 170 years. And it moved a couple times, and right before the epidemic, it had moved to Wabash and Van Buren. And I'm trying to picture that intersection, but there used to be a Catholic bookstore on that corner, and I think that's probably was the site of the Mercy Hospital at that point. Now, here's an interesting thing that I've come across. There was a large marine hospital at Fort Dearborn, within the confines of the fort itself. If you look at any kind of information about the cholera epidemic, there is no mention of the marine hospital. If you look at the history of the marine hospital, there is no mention of the cholera epidemic, other than the one that was caused by the Army in the first place. So my guess is that it was probably limited only to soldiers and sailors, so that the general public was not allowed to use that hospital. I don't know. It's kind of like one of those vague things you come across that you don't seem to get absolutely nowhere the more you do research on it. Well, anyway, in addition to the hospital, there were what were called dispensaries, which is something, we don't have those in Chicago anymore. I don't know of any place in the United States, but I think in some parts of Europe they may still have them. But a dispensary was kind of a combination of a walk-in clinic and a drugstore. And they were, for the most part, they were run by the medical colleges. Now, there were 2 and possibly 3 medical colleges already working in Chicago at this time. The first one was Rush Medical College, which you may recognize as now as part of Rush Medical Center on the west side of the Loop. The second was Chicago Medical College, which is now known as Northwestern University Medical Center, or medical school. And then there was a third medical college, which is kind of a mystery. It was called Hahnemann Medical College. We're not sure exactly when it was opened, and we're not sure when it built a hospital, but the hospital probably did not come until after the cholera epidemic. But it was a medical college dedicated to homeopathy, which was a kind of an alternate form of medicine. And there are still some homeopathic hospitals in the United States, not very many, but it was a very different approach to medicine. And they relied a lot upon drugs, certainly not a surgical type of institution at all. Now, 1854, where are the Lutherans? What are they up to? Well, in 1854, there were three congregations of Lutherans. There was a German congregation, a Norwegian congregation, and a Swedish congregation. The three congregations together probably had somewhere between 500 and 600 members. There were also a German evangelical congregation, and a Swedish Episcopal and a Swedish Methodist congregation. And those probably, again, the three of them probably had about 500 members or so. So we're talking about a German Scandinavian churched population of about 1,000 people or so. Now, did the cholera, or what did the cholera do to the Lutherans? Well, we really don't have much information on this. Whatever records there might have been were lost in the Great Chicago Fire. But the figures on how many people in Chicago died, those figures are all over the board. I think I could probably pull in 4 or 5 or 6 sources, and every one of them has a different number. But the best figure I can come up with is kind of a maximum of 3,500 that died in Chicago, which we're talking about 12% of the population. And this was primarily just in 1 year. So if you take that 12% figure across the board, there were probably among the Lutherans, there were probably 60 to 70 people who died. The Norwegian death rate seems to have been considerably higher than the other groups. And this was largely because of their, what some would say, their dissipated lifestyle, but it was also a matter of poverty and homelessness, and generally everybody was in unsanitary conditions, but the Norwegian immigrants are probably in worse than others. So let's assume 60 to 70 people died. Now, Pastor Carlson was the pastor of the Swedish church, as we know. Pastor Selle was still the pastor of the German church, and Pastor Anderson of the Norwegian church. And the three of them worked together, as well as, I think, probably several other ministers, pastors in the city. Primarily what they did was what any pastor would do under those circumstances was you care for the sick, you visit the sick, you visit the bereaved after somebody dies. In a couple cases, Pastor Carlson couldn't find caskets to bury his members, and so he ended up making the caskets himself. Pastor Monty, we don't have that in your job description.
Yeah, I did make a bowl once on a lathe in 7th grade.
So anyway, by the way, Pastor Carlson caught the cholera himself and had to take at least a week or 2 off to recover. Now, you may remember, may know this, that Pastor Carlson had 2 parsonages. He and his family. He had one in Chicago and another one out in St. Charles, and because he also served the parish in St. Charles. And so he went out to St. Charles to recover, and then came back and got into the struggle again. The treatment of cholera, while people were still alive, basically boiled down to two medications. One of them was opium, and the other one was something called calomel, which was a mercury compound, which was used for everything under the sun in the 1850s, 1860s, and then it was discovered by European scientists that the side effects of it were far worse than any disease it could conquer, and so it dropped out of the pharmacopoeia completely. And I don't think you'll ever find any doctor anywhere in this country who would prescribe it today. There were some after effects of cholera. If you were among the 50% who survived, often there were some effects on the heart and lung, but it was primarily the liver that seemed to be affected. And I don't know whether whatever was established, but Pastor Carlson did suffer from liver disease, and I think that may be what he actually died from many, many years later. Now, here we are out of the realm of historical fact and into the realm of historical speculation. Historians get very nervous when you do this, but I'm going to do it anyway. There are vague references, anecdotal references in some people's notes and letters about a Immanuel hospital. During the year of 1854, during the cholera epidemic. We know very, very little about it other than these anecdotal references. Where it was located, we don't know. Whether it was in the church building itself, in the parsonage, or if maybe they leased another building nearby. It's also a possibility that it may not have been strictly an Immanuel operation, that it might have been with other churches, like, for instance, the German and the Norwegian churches, or even the Methodist or Baptist. Well, I don't think there were any Baptist churches active in that area, but certainly there were Methodist churches and the Episcopalian, Swedish Episcopalian Church. So it's possible that it could have been located in any number of different places. The staffing was done by the pastor, or if it was a cooperative thing, the pastors and volunteers. There are no RNs on registered nurses noted in any of the information we have, and licensed practical nurses did not exist in Illinois for many, many years after that.
Neither
so
did
it was a volunteer
nurses.
staffing thing.
Neither did registered nurses. None of that was developed really at that time.
I'd have to do some searching on that. I'm not sure they were called RNs at that point. They were probably just called certified nurses or...
No, I don't think anything was that formalized then. Nursing was just kind of what women did back then. You got to wait till the Korean War and Florence Nightingale, and then decades later, and then we can talk about nurses as kind of registered.
I'm sorry, Marsha, I didn't hear all of that.
Okay, until Florence Nightingale, there was really nothing that made a nurse other than the local whoever wanted to decide to train nurses. There was nothing formalized at all until Florence Nightingale. So it would have been later. But. Yeah.
However, there were nurses, though again, the formalized, degree certainly wasn't out there, and the training was a very haphazard thing. But I think you'll find that probably in Philadelphia at this time, there would have been people that would have been called nurses, though again, what credentials they had would be pretty open. The early nurses in Europe and in the United States, and in the United Kingdom, were often kind of like a Protestant order of nuns. They were deaconesses. But the deaconess movement had not made it to Chicago at that point, definitely. I think it was pretty much confined to the East Coast and probably to Philadelphia. So yeah, again, the medical care depended on volunteers. If this Immanuel Hospital indeed existed, the one reference we have to it says that there were 6 beds. Again, we have no idea how long this thing lasted. there were a lot of different transient hospitals in Chicago, and many of them lasted only as long as the epidemic and then simply folded up. It seems that this may have lasted a little bit longer. There is a reference that it was merged with Hahnemann Hospital, which would have been in 1860. What does merger mean? Well, probably not much. It probably means that the beds and the medical equipment were transferred over to Hahnemann. But anyway, this is a big mystery, and we don't have much to go on here.
I'm thinking of the stained glass in the chapel that depicts care of someone suffering from cholera.
Right.
It seems to be the parsonage. But
it seems to be what? I'm sorry.
The parsonage.
Yeah, well, I think that was one of the sources that I came across a couple years ago said that it was actually housed in the parsonage. I guess there probably was room for 6 beds in the parsonage. But anyway, Pastor Carlson is known for his work among the cholera sufferers, and whether this hospital, how much of this is fact and how much is just legend, we're not sure. Now, other Lutheran hospitals come much later. So the Lutheran Deaconess Hospital in 1865 is founded. This becomes known as Passivant Hospital, which is now part of Northwestern. Augustana Hospital is founded in 1884 by the Swedish Augustana Synod. Norwegian American 10 years after that, and then Lutheran General was founded again as a deaconess hospital in 1898. And Lutheran General and Augustana, of course, are now part of Advocate Aurora Health System. So that comes much later. As far as any permanent institutions that come out of the cholera period, other than Mercy Hospital, there really wasn't much in terms of medical care. In terms of hospitals, at least. Okay, let's fast forward a bit. There are some other epidemics, but none of them quite reached the scale of the cholera epidemic. As I said, the last cholera epidemic was in 1873. There was 1877. There was a scarlet fever epidemic. Later, there was a smallpox epidemic. A pneumonia epidemic. Well, actually, 1891 was a really, really bad year. It was put forward as an excuse for not opening the Columbian Exposition because there were outbreaks of bronchitis and pneumonia and also typhoid fever. Now, let's move finally to the pandemic of 1918, which is erroneously called the Spanish flu. I don't know if anyone knows why it's called the Spanish flu, but it actually, the best guess we can make is that it started in Fort Riley, Kansas. A group of soldiers came down with a batch of flu, and they recovered fairly quickly, well enough so they could be shipped to France to fight in the First World War. And once they got to France, they began infecting the French soldiers, and the virus did a transition, a morphing, and became very highly virulent. Now, at that time, all of the newspapers of Europe, for the most part, had been censored. You did not mention epidemics or diseases because it was thought it would hurt morale of the soldiers and certainly of the citizens as well. The only newspapers that were not censored were those in Spain, and they picked up on this story and publicized it, and that's how it came to be called the Spanish flu. Now, it was caused by an unknown virus, and some of this is going to sound awfully familiar 100 years later. The virus was new to everybody, so there was no natural immunity anywhere in the world to it. I'm just going to give you some figures, and again, this will be in the booklet, so you don't have to remember them. But worldwide, it is believed that there were probably 100 million cases of the flu. Mm-hmm. Of those people, 50 million died. Mm-hmm. In the United States, there were 20 million cases, and this figure is fairly accurate, I think, which accounted for about 20% of the population of the country. The country at that time was about 100 million. There were in the United States 675,000 deaths. Illinois, there was 1,400,000 cases and 25,000 deaths. Chicago, quite amazingly, when you think about Chicago at that point, Chicago had only 50,000 cases, much, much smaller than the rest of Illinois. Again, the death figures are all over the board. Officially, there were about 8,500 deaths. But a study that was made after the fact said that there were probably in the 2 years, 1918 and 1919, there were probably 20,000 deaths from pulmonary causes. So that would include the flu, the virus. It would include other kinds of flu. It would include pneumonia, and any kind of other lung disease. So anyway, nevertheless, Illinois, it looks like the ratio, if you will, of illnesses to the population was about 20% of Illinois caught the Spanish flu. Where in Chicago, it was only about 2%. Mm-hmm. So it's obvious that in Illinois, it was much, much worse outside of the city, and it probably hit small towns. I mean, there are stories of entire families and villages being wiped out by the flu. Now, the health commissioner in 1918 was a man by the name of Robertson, Dr. Robertson, and he managed to pretty much close down the city for 30 days. And he particularly forbid any dancing in the city. Smoking in public places was forbidden. Movie theaters were closed down. Large public gatherings were also stopped. There was an ordinance passed that made it a city crime to spit on the street. And I know that sounds a little weird, but I think back to when I was maybe about 10 years old. I went into the bank in my hometown, and there was a big sign on the wall that said, "Do not spit on the floor." So apparently spitting wherever you were, hopefully not in somebody's living room, but almost everywhere else, was a very common practice. So anyway, you could be probably even imprisoned for spitting in public. Handkerchiefs were promoted as a way to prevent spreading of the virus, and masks also came into use at this time. Or I shouldn't say came into use. The use of them was accelerated. They had probably been around for a while. I'm thinking that diphtheria is one of those diseases that is spread in a similar fashion, and so that's probably where the mask originated, if not earlier.
Richard?
Yeah.
The spitting, I think, is because of chewing tobacco. Yeah. Everyone was spitting because of that. So I don't think it's that weird, but certainly not something we do today.
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly, what the Scandinavians call snuff, chewing tobacco, and then other forms of chewing tobacco. But also, this is a kind of a weird comment I came on one source that said that people had a habit while they were smoking to spit on the floor. I'm not sure why you would want to do that, but anyway, that was one of the laws, that if you were in a public transit facility, like a streetcar, if you spit on the floor, that was punishable by, it was you could be arrested for that.
Maybe they had to bite off the end of their cigar or cigarette.
Yeah, maybe cigars more than cigarettes. It just seems, I don't know, just very crude. But anyway, now Chicago's population at this point. Oh, let me back up for just one more thing. The churches remained open. They were not forced to curtail their worship services. In fact, they were encouraged to continue in their charity works, because the churches were, again, a kind of a mainstay of social work in the city. One of the interesting things about the 1918 virus is that the deaths from the disease were skewed not to the younger and older population, as in many viruses, but in this case toward the 18 to 40 age group. Mm-hmm. And epidemiologists who have looked at this data say it was probably because the people in this age group started out with a very mild case of that flu, and after a day or two of rest, they jumped up and went dancing or whatever, and then the day later they died. Mm-hmm. And it seems to have been a fairly constant progress that people that did not take early warning seriously are the ones who died. Mm. If you immediately took to bed rest and took care of yourself, got plenty of fluids, you had a chance at least of surviving. Not everybody could do that, of course. But it appears that again, a lot of people did not take this disease seriously until it became, when you start having whole families disappearing on you. It was often confused with just having a seasonal flu, or sometimes even just having a cold. Now, I have not been able, simply from time pressure, to go into the research that would needed to be to figure out exactly what Immanuel did during this. And actually, outside of laziness or inertia, there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that there probably wouldn't be much documentation at all, because this epidemic moved with great speed in and out. The first part of the epidemic was in September, which again was confined largely to military units at Great Lakes Naval Training Station, and also what we now call ROTC units. Seemed to be a major spreader of the 1918 epidemic. But October was the high point, and then by the middle of November, it was almost all over. I say almost because people continued to die from the virus well into 1919 and even into 1920. But nevertheless, it moved rather rapidly, and people, first of all, I think they greeted it with disbelief and incredulity. They really had no chance to reflect on what was happening until it was virtually over. And afterwards, you can't figure out, well, what happened. About the only thing you can do is count the number of dead. But in terms of what could have been done, there's really not an awful lot that you can say. Now, there are a couple other things that have to consider why there may not be an awful lot of documentation on how the churches responded. And one is, remember where we are in the time frame. This is October 1918. the war ends the next month. So this is kind of the height of the support the war movement, if you will. In fact, there is a Liberty Bond rally that is held during the height of the epidemic. It was felt that in many ways that the war effort was more important than dealing with the epidemic. The health commissioner, of course, did not agree. But also it's important, I think, to remember where Immanuel was in its history at this point. Immanuel was in the point of moving from the near north side to its present home in Edgewater. And so the congregation had a lot of things on its mind. It also, its pastor, Peter Pedersen, had resigned because he became a bishop, and they were in the process of calling a new pastor. So it was kind of a time of upheaval. Immanuel at that point had about 2,000 members, we think. How many people became infected with the flu? I'm sure less than 100. There probably were a few deaths, and I guess we could, if we found the right documentation, we could verify that. But we, again, like I say, there's not a lot of documentation that I know of about that period. I think in the history book that Pastor Bankston wrote, I don't know that it's mentioned at all. I'd have to get that book out again from the archives and take a look at it. Another thing to mention, and this sounds kind of snobbish, I know, but you must remember that Immanuel in 1918 is not the same Immanuel as it was in 1854. 1854 was largely a collection of poor immigrants, very few people of any means at all. By 1918, Immanuel was a very prosperous, if not one of the most prosperous congregations in the city. There were actually a couple of millionaires who were members of the congregation. And so they probably had the ability to sequester themselves and avoid contact with the virus.
Richard, do you suppose the decision to move north to Edgewater was in part influenced by the desire to get out away from places that had more illness?
Yeah, what had happened was what I described as the Swedish section of Chicago, which sort of centered around Division Street and the area just south of there, and from about LaSalle all the way over to the river. That area had become increasingly Italian. Huge influx of Italian immigrants, and consequently had become also primarily Roman Catholic. Several Catholic churches had been built in that area. And so it was felt that since probably a majority of the members no longer lived in that neighborhood, they had moved up to various places like Edgewater and Bowmanville and what we now call Andersonville. So it was felt that the church should be closer to the people. And so that was the main impetus for moving at that time. It was a debated subject, and it's a kind of a complicated subject because the Augustana Synod had already established a mission church right near Senn High School, and that was Bethel Lutheran, or the Bethel Chapel, it was actually called. And so eventually that merged with Immanuel, and then they built the new building. And of course, the area that had been taken over by the Italian immigrant community, then emptied out again as the Italians moved out to the suburbs in the 1940s and 1950s, and that became the impetus for the public housing projects in Cabrini Green. So it really went, the area went from probably originally German to then to Swedish to Italian to mostly African American. And now I'm not sure what it all is. Well, that's about as far as I want to go. There's a lot more to the story about how Chicago improved the health of its citizens and became one of the world's major medical centers. But that's a whole different story. And of course, now it brings us up to the COVID crisis. And I just saw some statistics before we went on that today may turn out to be the worst day in the history of this epidemic, of this pandemic, in terms of number of dead and number of new cases around the world. But anyway, I think it is. I can find, and I could do this, and maybe I will in the booklet, draw some comparisons and contrasts between these three different epidemics: the cholera epidemic of 1854, the 1918 viral epidemic, and COVID. Because there are some interesting things, but what seems to be the overriding thing from this is taken off the top of my head, so to speak, was a sense that one did not want to believe what was happening. Mm-hmm. There was a sense of denial that took many different forms. And, we know the consequences in the first two cases. Though, again, Chicago was not as bad as many places. So I guess that's kind of a lesson for the day. But anyway, thank you.
Question?
Managed to cram all of that into a little over an hour. Any questions about anything?
Yeah. So don't you imagine that in the 1950s, when they put that plaque up regarding the plague, that they had maybe some information we don't have now, that they would memorialize that? It's hard to me to believe that they would have done it if they didn't have some more information about it. I don't know.
Are you talking about the stained glass window in the chapel?
Yes. Yeah, why, I just assumed there was a story behind that was somewhere available, but maybe hidden away somewhere. The other thing I wanted to comment on, you talked about the hotels cleaning out their water and all, but in the 1850s, when my hero John Snow was doing all his experiments in London, no one would believe him that cholera was passed through water. So unless Chicago was just way ahead of the times, I imagine they didn't really know either. Mm-hmm. But later, yeah, it was more generally accepted.
Well, you'd want to filter out bits of clothing and dog's ears.
Okay, so they're filtering out big chunks, but they might not, you got to have microfiltering to get out bacteria.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the cholera bacteria was not isolated until 1884. So, people working with the disease was really kind of working blindly in one sense. They knew the symptoms and they could see the bad conditions that seemed to be causing it, but they didn't really know what was happening. The virus, I'm not sure, maybe somebody else knows, the virus for the 1918 epidemic, it was, I think, several years before that was positively identified.
Right, took a really long time.
Yeah, actually, more recently, people dug up bodies in Iceland that died from that flu. Yeah. And they've sequenced the genome of that flu, so we know where it fits with all the rest of them.
But what year did that happen? Do you know what year that happened? Because I know it took a really long time.
That happened just like 5 years ago.
Yeah, okay. Because during the time of the actual epidemic, one of the theories was that it was this bacteria, Haemophilus influenza, which is why it got the name it did, because it was found in so many victims with the virus, but it was just a secondary infection. We don't know. But.
Yeah, I should have mentioned something about that. The Rosenau vaccine was administered to several thousand people because that was thought to be a vaccine against the 1918 virus. And like Marcia said, that vaccine was a mixture of all kinds of different bacterial agents, and it probably did save a few lives who had secondary infections, but it had no effect whatsoever on the virus itself.
Just underscoring the people who cared for those with cholera, given the fact that they didn't know really what they were dealing with, it just, to me, it underscores the mixture of compassion and foolishness and courage and faithfulness that those people had to do that.
Yeah, I mean, it was, like I said, Pastor Carlson came down with cholera, took a week or two off, and then came back and was caring for the people in their homes and on the street. And
yeah,
it is kind of a remarkable story in many ways.
Yeah.
Even though we don't have a lot of details about it.
Well, the fact that maybe there were two parsonages helps me understand how it was possible to bring those people, suffering from cholera into a parsonage, if indeed that's what happened. Because you wouldn't want to risk your family,
Yeah. Well, again, this is something that I found in some letter of somebody, is that the family did not stay in Chicago. Pastor Carlson stayed in Chicago for the most part, except when he was recovering, but the family was out in St. Charles.
Yeah.
Yeah, generally in those situations, better to move away from the urban center as much as possible.
Yeah.
Even in the current pandemic, the rural part got hit much later than the urban part. If it had protected themselves a little better, maybe they would have gotten hit.
As with COVID, yeah.
Well, again, thanks for your attention, and if you have any suggestions or further questions, let me know, and I can try and incorporate that into the booklet.
When you do the booklet, just so you know, a vector is a living organism that spreads the germs. You said something about war and other events are vectors, but that's not accurate. They certainly play a role, but they are not vectors.
I'm sorry, Marcia.
I'll email you. I'll email you.
Okay, yeah, sure. Yeah, please feel free to email me on anything.
Okay. Have a good night, all.
Okay, thanks.
Don't go yet. I have just one quick announcement. And that is next week is our last one for this term. And Michelle Nickerson from Loyola will be here to talk about the struggle for women to get the vote. And since it's the 100th anniversary of that, I thought that would be a very appropriate one to end on then. So that'll be next week.
We should all try to recruit somebody to attend with us.
Yeah, that would be nice. What, Marcia?
Weren't you asking, Monty, what time, or somebody was asking what time we're doing, what time on Sunday, the 17th of January, are we having that discussion on CAST? Or did you?
Are we starting at 3 or at 4? Those were the two times I think we had. And everybody gets a vote here, including David, because he's been showing up.
Okay.
So I think we could decide if you.
Bless you.
Just hang tight.
I think
so.
I'm just waiting to be informed.
Marcia or David, do you have any preference, 3 or 4 on a Sunday afternoon for,
Discussion.
well, for a forum, basically? Well, yes.